Okay, so here we are back with Al, Conversations with Al. And we're going to talk about John Cage. We're on part 2. So last time we covered the early days of the Black Earth group and some of those early pieces. Where should we pick up the conversation? Is there anything we need to talk about before we dive into that? I mean, reflecting on what we're all going through here. I mean, I don't know, but
yeah, I guess we'll find it if we need to. Okay. You know, where it picks up with Percussion Group Cincinnati is that I think I talked about it previously, that we did in fact play. We were playing both older pieces and newer pieces, and there was this one. Do you remember? Did we talk about the Quartet last time?
We didn't. No. Talked about imaginary landscapes, Credo and Us. I think we talked a little bit about branches, Child of Tree branches. I don't think we talked about anything else. I think those were the pieces that we covered.
One of the times we were with him in Cologne, or in Witten, outside of Cologne, a big festival sponsored by the radio in Cologne, and we played the Quartet for some years. We had made a version of the Quartet 1935, and even back then I think that was a somewhat recent publication, and it's very clear that back in 1935 he had just written this out on graph paper, even though that's not how it's published now as something rewritten, but clearly it was graph paper once, with no indications beyond, some stems up and stems down, which sort of give you a sense of some kind of phrasing in different places. But all of the instrumentation and changing instrumentation is of course up to anybody who plays it. And this he had written about being from the time when, again, he was working with friends and dancers. And in fact, I think his wife at that time was doing book binding, and they had book binding materials, big blocks of wood and pieces of cardboard and big books. And that was part of the inspiration for making this simple kind of music. The reason that so this is published long after the fact, and what was so what occurred to us right then, or it occurred to me, we had been playing Amores, but there is no piece where prepared piano is actually combined with percussion instruments. And this is not so, because even in Amores, it's all separate movements. It's not so hard to figure out, because the people for whom he was writing, people who could play percussion stuff, as we said previously, were usually not skilled percussionists. They were just willing, enthusiastic people. So to actually combine percussion instruments with prepared piano struck him as being a difficult balance problem, because the prepared piano, it's like a harpsichord. You have very nice recordings of it, but that's because the microphone, like a harpsichord, is right up on the instrument. And when you put all of this stuff inside, it's actually a very delicate sound. And even like in second construction, there's a piano part, or in the first imaginary landscape, there are little piano things in some of these pieces, but not the sophisticated real preparations and tones. Okay, so the idea was that this would be a wonderful experiment in combining all of the sounds of a prepared piano. And Jim, and in that case, Bill Uhas was with Jim and I in those years, could choose all kinds of little tambrack, what Herbert Brunn once called a rack of timbres was a tambrack. That was Herbert Brunn's idea.
Didn't Michael Udow co-opt that though? I mean,
he did actually.
Okay.
And
but that was Herbert Brunn's idea originally.
It was Herbert's idea.
Okay.
And the first time I met Herbert, I was a senior at Oberlin, so that would have been in, I don't know, 1971 or something like that. And Herbert was very excited about this idea and described the whole thing to me then. But Mike was around U of I, and so Mike also heard it, and he then even wrote a piece called Tambrack Quartet. Anyway, so my thought was that probably on the prepared piano, I could take two parts. I mean, I think, I forget, in my 3 and 4, I had a right hand and a left hand. So I played two parts throughout the whole range of the instrument. And then Jim and Bill found all kinds of, interesting little things to do to mesh with these tiny little woodblock and gong sounds. So that, it was, again, I guess if you have 4 people, yeah, sure, you should use 4 people. But the reason was that we felt like the experiment was just to once have a real piece and a piece of cage that integrated these two worlds. So we did that piece a lot, and we played it in Germany on that tour, and he heard it and made some comments about what he remembered having done back the first time they read through it. He did, and I'm recalling now that after we came off stage, he asked me if I knew a poem by E. Cummings. I think it was called 5 is Not 5 or something like that. Just meaning, again, the first thing that occurred to him was some, lovely sort of sophisticated reference that we were playing a quartet with 3 people, and what he thought of was a poem of a friend of his that was had something to do with 5 not being 5. So, and it's interesting that it was actually Michael Williams, Michael Williams of Imbira, especially later became known. Michael did, I guess it was his master's thesis or a doctoral thesis, I forget, on Cage, and went to the Northwestern Library archives, went through all kinds of stuff, and did a number of interviews with Cage. And in his published thesis, it's just a tiny little remark that he had a conversation with Cage, and Cage says, well, the trio from 1936 is the same thing as the quartet. I did it the same. It was just on graph paper for any instruments, but then I orchestrated it myself. I just took, one possible way of some of the things we had done. And it's in that trio where the little woodblock movement of Amores then got lifted from. And indeed, that's the most successful movement of that little trio. But once I had read that in Michael's thesis, of course, that was then the needed license to go back and play the trio as well. And what we made then was a piece for, it's kind of piano 6 hands. All of us sit at a prepared piano and do a little bit of reaching inside and a little bit of playing a few extra sounds. But I could encourage anybody. The trio itself is not so interesting, actually, and you can make it better, and it's perfectly kosher to do so.
Could you talk a little bit about, speaking of prepared piano, we talked a lot about Amores last time too, in the difficulty of that one, and you even went to the piano and demonstrated some of that, which was fun. But with the prepared piano, I mean, there are a number of those pieces. I did one when I was with you up there, the music for Marcel Duchamp, which is one that percussionists can play. It's not so difficult. You don't have to have great piano technique to be able to pull that off. But part of the problem of prepared piano is acquiring a piano that you're allowed to prepare. You know, those of us that are at universities, I mean, I know our folks are real protective of those beautiful Steinway instruments. They don't want us getting in there and messing around with it. But could you talk a little bit about the logistics of like how you know, somebody wants to get involved with prepared piano, like how do you, I mean, do you just ask forgiveness instead of permission? And maybe you could recommend other pieces that are, you know, accessible to percussionists. Like which one of those pieces, you know, do you think that we could sort of take on?
Peters did publish, maybe it's by now 10 or more years ago, but I think there are 2 volumes of the piano music where all of these pieces are redone in finale. You know, I mean, for years and years, you could get these pieces individually, and maybe you still can in his manuscript, but then they collected it all. And I believe it is 2 volumes. And I don't think it wouldn't be just prepared piano, because there are a number of pieces that we also know, like In a Landscape, that one, or Dream, exactly, which I forget which one of those he says could be prepared or not. Some of those even say you can prepare it or not prepare it, or just play it the way it is. But I think those pieces are in this collection, but there are a bunch of things. There's one called In the Name of the Holocaust. And boy, I'm forgetting right now, but if you have this volume, which I think most libraries have now, you just easily open it up and find all of these pieces where they're, instead of, even Amores has, I think, 17 preparations, something like that, and some of these pieces have 6. So that's already a start for going to a piano technician. I've had the experiences where people absolutely say no, they don't want you at all. Usually, by now, by the late 20th century, there was a piano in most halls where we would go, which was, there was one which was absolutely untouchable, but there would be one which would be reserved for that kind of activity, and maybe one in the practice room. The piano tech shop here in Cincinnati, the guy for the last number of years, a couple of decades maybe, was really great about it. And he said, come in, let's talk about it. I want to show you when I tune a piano, this is how I touch it. This is what, but truth of the matter is, what you're doing, if you're careful about it and, not jamming things into the strings, but, use a screwdriver or something to separate the strings, put the thing there, then let the thing come back in. He said, people who are playing Liszt concertos on these pianos, they're breaking strings. They're doing more damage to these pianos than your tiny little thing, if you're careful about not touching the strings and not scraping and these sorts of things. So also, another thing, it's a very different sound, but now you can get also not metal screws, but nylon screws. Mm-hmm. Of course, they're much more lightweight, but it's the same idea. And so actually, Mark Saya is a composer who's written a bunch of music for us and wrote a beautiful piece just a couple of years ago, where all the preparations are with these nylon screws and washers, and it's more delicate, but it's a very, very nice thing. So what else? So we having met him on that German tour, and then played again. The one we did branches, I think the first time was in Italy, and there was an afternoon in a hotel, in tiny little hotel room, and he invited me to, well, you want to come by for lunch? We could have something. Now, we've all seen pictures. There's some pictures of him, out in the woods doing mushroom hunting, and he owned this huge old traditional wicker picnic basket, right, with the two things that flip out at him. Well, he carried this thing. This is in the era before the 20th century, before 9/11. So he would take this big wicker basket with him on the airplane, and in this basket he would have various breads that he made, and peanut butter, and things like this. He carried his own, because he was on this
diet, right?
This macrobiotic diet that Yoko Ono and John Lennon had turned him on to for his arthritis. Okay, so great. I go to his hotel room, his little room, and he's got this wicker basket. He opens up, and this bread. So he had made this bread, and I suppose it was from, what is that? This bread cookbook from that era.
Not the Tassajara bread.
Yes, that one.
Oh,
yes.
Really? Oh,
yeah,
wow.
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely. So this bread he brings out, it's like meatloaf. I mean, not that I've had meatloaf in 40 years, but
this pretty dense bread.
Dense, wet, heavy thing, and what did we put on it? I don't know. Celery or something, but peanut butter probably. I mean, he was very excited about this bread he had made and carried with him. So there came this conversation, and he said he wanted to, he was, as we have said before, he's always most interested in whatever he was doing right then. He didn't care about the great old pieces. He even preferred that people didn't play them. So he said he was very excited that he had this brand new idea, and he had just he had a commission from a group in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh New Music Ensemble was 6 people, and in conjunction with a young composer who did all of this computer work, he had come up with this whole system of these Calder-like mobiles of floating time. Now, we mostly know about these things from the number pieces, this whole set of pieces that comes at the end of his life, late Cage, the number pieces, and they're all organized by these time block kinds of things. But actually, that came already in 1985, was it? Something like that. It predated this. And he explained that, and he showed me this whole thing of how there's a beginning window, you can come in between, and an ending window, and the music that he made between there was sometimes it was very, like almost looks like boulez, it's just very virtuosic kind of stuff, and sometimes it's a single tone, and you would go back and forth between these phrases. Okay, anyway, he showed, he had sketches of this stuff, and he was carrying it with him because he was still working on it, and was just having fun, telling somebody who would be excited about it. That next year, so when, I'm sorry, I should have checked my dates. Maybe it was 1984. There was to be a PASIC convention in Ann Arbor that coming fall. UW was hosting it there at University of Michigan. This was in the days before it was in a convention center. And a number of different groups were could play concertos. And UDAL had arranged that we could have the University of Michigan band, famous University of Michigan band, wind ensemble, and Percussion Group Cincinnati was going to do a concerto with them. There was a composer who had written a wonderful piece for us in the previous year or two, and had agreed to make a piece. So I got a call sometime that summer from the composer saying, it's not going to happen. I'm terribly sorry. I feel just terrible about this, but I wanted to tell you as soon as I could, so you could do something. You could maybe still save the opportunity, but things are whatever. Things in his life, something. Okay, so that was off, and it was so. Necessity being the mother of invention here, I started really thinking, and I'm not sure which came first, why I was, maybe I just went to Cage's catalog, or maybe I knew. So in 1976, Cage had written this piece called Renga, a big commission for orchestras for the US bicentennial. But I knew that it was a piece not necessarily or it was just for any 76 musicians, and it's so-called graphic score, because he also writes a lovely story that he had been doing all of this reading of Thoreau and using Thoreau for many different text pieces, the journals, writing through the journals of Thoreau. And that in the margins of all of these Thoreau journals for years and years, Thoreau would make little silly little drawings, just for his own reference or something like that. All kinds of tiny little amateurish drawings. And at one point, Cage says he realized that this was some of the most interesting stuff in the whole journals, all these crazy drawings. So he took all of these drawings and sort of superimposed them on graph paper. And this is the score of this piece. Chance operations as to who was going to play which little tiny segment of each drawing. So the conductor conducts time passing through all of these superimposed drawings, and the 76 musicians have little fragments of the drawing and that they contribute to making that drawing sort of come to life. It's a simple explanation. Then, for the bicentennial, what he did was made kind of a concerto grosso, and this was what the orchestra did, Renga. But then out front of the orchestra, there was a piece called Apartment House 1776, in a reference again to the bicentennial. And if I remember correctly, it was for the four singers were a Native American doing Native American kinds of things. There was a African American, the whole history of that kind of music. There was a Sephardic cantor doing Jewish things, and then I think there was just music from around the bicentennial, Christian hymns of this. So in a sense, he was touching upon different spiritual traditions of America, which were all present in 1776. Similarly, however, he made chance operations out of this. But anyway, the way the piece then worked was as a concerto for these four vocal soloists in front, on top of an orchestra. And the orchestra music, because it was all these drawings of Thoreau, is just constant smears. Everybody is doing glissandos, and it's a very smeary is the best thing. Whereas obviously the people in front, the concerto soloists, were vocalists who were speaking and shouting and chanting and doing very discreet sort of things. So I read again the description of this of in his catalog, and how he's saying that it was a piece made for the purpose of a celebration, of a society's celebration. You know, it could be used in the case of any society that was doing a celebration, a commemorative sort of thing. So at some point, some little light bulb went off for me, and I thought, okay, so he had written with the computer. The computer had produced this piece which he called Music for Six, and there was one percussion part in that for 50 instruments, looking sometimes like Boulez. You know, you choose your own instruments, but quite virtuosic and in this time floating kind of thing. So it occurred to me, couldn't he just push the button on the computer again and then again? And, you know, it'll just have a different seed number. I had sort of learned this from Herbert Brunn, the way he did all of his beautiful graphics, so that you could have one basic kind of structure. But if the computer gets a different seed number for starting its process, it'll give you all kinds of variations on that. Okay, so I thought, wouldn't it work if there were 3 percussionists out in front instead of discursive vocalists? Why not 3 percussionists? And then in the back would be all of the smear, and we'd be very busy doing all of this kind of stuff. Right. And he didn't have to really compose anything new. He just had to push a button, you know, and make 2 more percussion parts. Okay, so I thought this was a pretty good idea. So I remember very clearly, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I had his phone number. I call him up in his apartment, and so I described the whole. I said, "Sorry to bother you about this, but something has come up, and you were telling me how excited you were about this whole new system you were working on. Here's my idea. What do you think of this?" And just as I told you now, I go through this whole thing with him with great excitement and enthusiasm. And I get to the end of it, and he says, "No, I don't think so. Just kind of an older. He was 70 years old then, or something like that. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, and well, thank you very much, but I don't think so." Well, can you imagine what an idiot I felt? I'm this guy calling up from rural Cincinnati, calling the most famous composer in the world. I'm not commissioning him to do anything. I'm saying, "Hey, I got a great idea for you to write me a piece." So I felt much worse about that than I felt about not having a piece to play at PASIC the next spring. I mean, I knew that, okay, I'm going to have to solve that problem otherwise, but I just felt so stupid. The next morning, and of course I remember this very well, 10 a.m., the phone rings, and you have to imagine these are still, black phones sitting on the desk with a wired coil, and you pick it up.
Your caller ID was not.
Yeah, the phone rings, and you pick it up, and he says, "Alan, it's John. I think you know my music better than I do." Exactly what he said. I've been studying your idea, and I think it's a wonderful idea this morning. And now, tell me once again, how does this go? That's exactly what he said. So I explained the whole thing again. And, he said, "Sure, yes, I think I could do that." So the interesting thing is, this is how there's a piece in the catalog now which is just called Music for blank. Because what happened then is that he withdrew the piece called Music for Six, and he had actually sent it to. Then in the meantime he sent it to me, and I have a copy of this, the 6 parts of something that was called Music for Six, published by Peters, and it's printed on there, Music for Six, for the Pittsburgh New Music Ensemble. So he realized that what he could then do was actually use this computer program to just generate all the time, whenever it was convenient or for him to generate more parts to this. After about 10 years of occasionally doing this, I think there are now 17 different parts. And any of these parts, you can play music for one, get one of the percussion parts or get the piano part or get the cello part or whatever and play music for one. And there's 30 minutes of material, play as much of it as you want. But if you look through the catalog, he actually ended up making one more percussion part. So there are 4 percussion parts. There are 2 piano parts. There's enough for a string quartet. There are various wind parts. Any combination of all of that becomes music for, and then you fill in the blank. So what we played was music for 3. And then on the Peters publication of this, it just says music for blank, for the Pittsburgh New Music Ensemble, Percussion Group Cincinnati, and Zeitgeist, another group in Minneapolis who around the same time had gotten some money to actually commission him. So he just rolled that in.
Now this, I'm sorry, I just pulled up the John Cage works list here, and I was just reading parts available for, gosh, I can't see it. Hang on a second. I'm going to put on my glasses. Parts without score, no fixed relations, title to be completed by adding to music for, and then the number of players, just as you said. Parts available for voice, flute, oboe, clarinet, horn, trumpet, trombone. 4, it says 4 percussion.
Yes.
2 pianos,
so he
2
started
violins.
with 1, he added 2 for us, so that was music for 3, and that was actually later Jan Williams wanted some music from him, so he wrote a 4th percussion part. So you could play a percussion quartet using those 4 parts. Mm-hmm.
It says other comments, each part consists of pieces and interludes, notated on 2 systems using the flexible time brackets. Yeah, I know that I know I've heard you talk about, I've heard the story before. I don't know that I've looked at all those parts. Would be interesting to go back.
Well, then the part for voice, much some years later on, he made by this same thing. He made for a single vocalist using all just little bits of little phonemes, little parts of words and phonemes and things. And on Bonnie Whiting's recording of Cage, various Cage solo pieces, she does music for 2 by 1. She does one of the percussion parts and the vocal part by just overlaying them. Yeah. Yeah, so it then stumbles into another story. So when we then, okay, so now we had a piece to play with the University of Michigan band.
So are there any recordings of this? Does this, I mean, do you have an archival recording or anything?
Yeah, sure. I have the original with the Michigan band, and then in 2012, I mean, we tried to sell this piece to everybody around the country. This was, I mean, geez, John Cage had made an orchestra concerto for us. Yeah. Nobody had any interest whatsoever. We never played it again. We played it as a trio, just that much of it. But even that was hard because it was an annoying piece because he wrote it for 50, meaning 150 instruments for 3 people, and it takes a lot of pre-figuring it out kind of work. Because some of the instruments are used once, some of the instruments are used a lot throughout the piece, and you want to get that figured out. And
sure.
So anyway, but in 2012, in the Cage centennial year, I had convinced the school orchestra here to do it again. So very kindly we got then. So actually, that's the only real orchestra version we have of it. So I have a recording of that as well, which is very, very nice. That's more recent with Rusty and Jim and myself. So I got a call from him then again. Well, actually, how did it happen? Tom Siwe was the president of PAS in that at that time. I guess I had been in touch, and I said, okay, well, we're playing a concerto of Cage. That was so then Tom Siwe said, well, maybe this is the year we should induct Cage into the Hall of Fame. Because if he's going to, because Cage said he would, he was at least having this big piece premiered there. So there was then another phone conversation, and I actually think, as I remember it, that Tom said, well, if you're in touch with him, could you tell him we want to, that we're going to send him this, induct him to the hall, and see if he'll come, if he'll come to that. And so I remember him, again, I remember it as Cage getting a phone call from Cage saying, well, I just received this thing from, and he didn't know what PAS was, of course. It's from some society, and I don't know, and they want me to come, and what do you think? What should I do? And he said, I've always liked percussionists. They've always been good to me. They always played my music, but I don't know what this thing is. And I said, yeah, you should come. That would be great. We'll play your piece. And so that is how he came. So he heard this one performance that we did of the piece with the band. He got his induction into the Hall of Fame. I think it was then maybe a year later. So I'm reminded of another story about his very lovely, gentle character. In Bowling Green, Ohio, up near Cleveland, there's been for many years this MidAmerica New Music Festival. And for some reason, I remember it was the 6th iteration of this, and maybe this was, about, again, mid-'80s, 1986, maybe something like that. They were inviting Cage, and Cage had accepted to come, and he had mentioned, he had this piece, and these were the possibilities, and we were just right down here in Cincinnati, some hours away. So they invited us as well, and the main concert of that of the 3-day festival was one where the first half of the concert we played just music for 3 in the big hall, and then the second half, the second hour of that concert, Cage read. He was then on stage by himself, looking like we all know all of these pictures. He just sits at a little table with one little light and one little microphone and a big book and quiet and a stopwatch, and quietly reads for an hour. So he was reading the piece called Mushrooms et Variazione, one of these big, crazy Gnostic poems that goes on for an hour about using all mushroom, Latin mushroom kind of things. And the 3 of us were out in the hall, all around the hall, playing But What About the Noise of crumpling paper. So we each had a little setup, and we just recycled this music, these quiet little plops and little water and crumpling and all of this stuff for an hour while he sat on stage and did this reading. At the end, at the end of the performance, so then, he's stands up and nods and, and wanted us to come on stage and take the bow with him. Yes. So we did that. And then we're walking off stage, to backstage. And he says to me, "How did you do?" Or, he says, how did you do? And I said, "Well, what is there to do? Actually, we were great, Yeah, well, it was fun." He said, I did very poorly. I did very, very poorly. my timings were, I got so far behind my stopwatch, and I did very badly. um, as though it could possibly make any difference that anybody could possibly know. Everybody was just charmed beyond. I mean, either you hated it because it was just this old man droning on in some crazy nonsensical poetry for an hour, or you were just charmed and it didn't matter. But but he was very serious about it. He had his clock timings and he was supposed to be going through this, and he got off, and he considered that he had done a bad job. So again, he was a very genuine, by that point in his life anyway. I didn't know him when he was forging his career and becoming very famous, but by that point in his life, he was a tremendously genuine, warm, honest human being to be around. And it really gave me it has given me a very, very good feeling about playing all of this music ever since. I mean, mostly, as I had told the story about happily being outvoted, about not wanting to give John Cage time on an LP where younger, unknown composers should be on. And though we've basically followed that all of our career, that we've played a lot of music by CCM student composers. We're here every day. We meet people, you notice who's an interesting young person. Doesn't matter that they're writing percussion stuff. You just hear it in, an electronic piece or something, or somebody who comes to ask questions. So we've always played the music of students or our friends or people that we meet on tour. But in that sense, Cage was one kind of notable exception, but it was because he had become a known, I felt like I knew him as a person, and made a big difference. Yeah.
So with these last couple of minutes, what now, from the perspective of right now, today, what is, in your opinion, what is the legacy of John Cage? I mean, there's the music, there's the books, the philosophy, the art, it's so much to take in.
Yeah.
And that, I'll just leave it open-ended. What's the legacy today? What do we do with all of this? And where do you think it is right now? In terms, we just had in 2012 we had the 100th celebration, and there were many concerts all over the world, really. But now in 2020, where are we at?
I think remembering that the music that interested him the most was whatever he was working on right then, and that the fact that he could have kept on generating any kind of style that he had come to, he was honestly always sort of pushing himself. So that's one. So partly what that tells me is, though we want to do some honoring of the traditions of our teachers and mentors, and in that sense, Cage is that for us as percussionists, and an honoring of that is to know all of the music, not just third construction or what branch do maybe people play branches a little bit more, but And to know the music, it's implies to have to do some of the reading. I mean, I was with him a number of times where people would come up and ask him questions, and he was always very nice about it. But I heard him say a number of times, "Well, I think I've talked about that in my essay, you know, whatever, or in my, do you know my book called Silence?" um, he was never a jerk about it, but you can imagine how many times he was asked, you know, questions that if you were really interested in him and his philosophy, it had been discussed, you know, in great depth, and it behooves us to pay attention to that sort of thing. But I think the fact that he was so well known as someone who supported younger composers, who went to concerts, who made who, you know, privately made grants to people who were in trouble here or there. By the time that he had money, he was willing to share it with people, as you know from your own experience. But the takeaway is he was not interested in who the famous people were. He was not interested in himself being famous or why it was important to play his famous pieces. He was interested in the next ideas of creative work, and that this was always related to his own erudition. I mean, he read spiritual philosophy and philosophers and novels and poetry and experiment. He really knew all of that, and his music was just part of all of that. And to play his music, I think it sort of asks us to go on that journey a little bit in that whole way.
I remember when I was at Cincinnati, and I had played a number of his pieces by that point, and had read all the books, and I was well versed, you know, but I hadn't done any of those number pieces at that point. And you had organized a performance of 14. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And so, you know, all of these very accomplished young professionals, you know, students, and we played that piece 14. And I remember the first rehearsal of that piece, I got to play the bowed piano part. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, yeah, I do.
Bows with all the horsehair and all of that from the bows. And so anyway, just what I remember about that piece is my part in particular. I mean, there's not a whole lot to do. I mean, you have to be very concentrated about when each thing happens and making sure I was pulling the right string. And it's a very delicate thing, but I come to the point, which is the first rehearsal. Here we are with all of these really, you know, very highly trained musicians on all of the instruments. And, you know, you gave a little introduction. Well, let's just play the piece once, and then we'll have a talk about it and see how it goes. And I remember we played this thing, and at the end of it, everybody was just dumbfounded. I mean, a lot of these other musicians who, you know, they were working on their orchestral excerpts, and this was just a thing they were going to do, but, you know, taking it seriously, but that wasn't really their thing. But at the end of it, it was a real spiritual experience, you know. I mean, it was truly deeply felt in the room, and it was just those 14 people and you. I don't think anyone else was in the room, but we all had a sense that something magical had just happened in a real event. Something had transpired in that room. And then, of course, that happened every time we played that piece. And boy, that one is a really, for me, that one sits very high in the musical experiences that I've had of just, you know, transformative in a way that it's sort of hard to talk about. It was, you kind of had to be there and, you know, and experience that. So to me, that's what I hope that others can experience with some of this music, particularly that late music. It's very contemplative, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And very beautiful. I mean, beautiful. And there's a wonderful essay too by William Brooks, a composer at the University of Illinois, where he points out that partly the reason that so much beauty in a kind of traditional sense comes back into Cage's music in the very end is that he honestly had gone through all of the stages where he rejected anything and everything, he accepted anything and everything. And by going through the process honestly, he could come back to allowing major thirds and fragments of melodies and things like this, because it wasn't from his taste and memory and desire to put them there, but he had found ways to allow them to be there. And so, as you say, these late pieces, in a somewhat traditional sense even, are often very beautiful pieces. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thanks for doing these conversations. We're gonna continue. I don't know what our next topic will be, but we'll,
maybe Herbert Brunn.
Maybe Herbert Brunn. Okay, plant the seed for that one. All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you.